Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming out today. My name is Kimberly Bradley, the Conversations Curator at Art Basel in Basel. This talk looks at how technology is shifting the communities comprising the traditional art world and revamping how we view, make, and value art. On stage with us are Ben Davis, national art critic from Artnet News in New York, and France-based artist Cécile B. Evans. The talk is moderated by my esteemed colleague, Dr. Jeni Fulton, head of editorial at Art Basel. There will be time for questions at the end of the panel. Let's give our speakers a big warm round of applause and enjoy the conversation.
Thank you very much, Kim, and thank you for joining us today for this quite topical discussion, I believe. As Kim said, we will be taking questions at the end. And I'm going to start off by introducing our panelists. Now, Cécile B. Evans lives and works in La Plaine, Saint-Denis. Their works concern themselves with the rebellion of emotions as they come into contact with structures and such as technological systems. They have previously exhibited at Centre Pompidou, Tate Liverpool, Lafayette Anticipation, Whitechapel Gallery, Haus der Kunst, and Singapore Art Museums, among others. Their films have been screened at festivals including New York's Film Festival and the International Film Festival in Rotterdam. And the works are held in public collections, including the Museum of Modern Art and the Whitney Museum of American Art. Ben Davis is the author of 9.5 theses on art and class, which Art News has named one of the best books of the decade in 2019, so congratulations, Ben. And Art in the Afterculture, published in 2022, named an Art Book of the Year by the New York Times and Times Literary Supplement. He has been the national art critic for Artnet News since 2016, and a very influential writer, and certainly someone whose works have really concerned themselves with the interstices between art and technology. Artificial intelligence and blockchain have already begun to change how we make, show, and value art, leading to the creation of entirely new cultural communities and forms of art making. The impact of technology will only accelerate in the years to come, bringing radically new perspectives on questions surrounding creativity, originality, cultures, and values. Today, we're going to discuss the pitfalls and upsides of expanding the boundaries of the traditional art world, and we will try to speculate on how technology might revamp avant-garde art making and viewing. Recently, there's been lots of breathless excitement around the novelty of AI-generated artworks and images. For example, most recently, MoMA purchased Rifik Anadol's work in 2022. There's been a huge explosion in artworks made with tools such as Midjourney and DALL-E, and really a big growth in the presence of AI in the post-ChatGPT era. However, we've also seen some of the downsides with the Writers' Guild strike in America and the actor strike in America, some court cases as well, with Getty Images currently in London, and also the New York Times suing ChatGPT for using their works to train their generative adversarial networks. And so we're here to kind of ponder what the impact of these will be on the wider art world. Ben, you have written a number of articles that have viewed these forces rather critically. And I quote you here, you have said, the balance of forces between art and technology does not favor art. Can you talk about that? And what drove you to say that? Because it's quite a big statement.
Well, I think it's just obviously true. I should think that's uncontroversial, actually. I was thinking specifically about, well, I was looking at the data just about graduation degrees people get in college, you know? Mm-hmm. And all humanities degrees have been declining over the last 10 years. And technology degrees, anything in the applied sciences or technology, has been dramatically expanding. And I think that's very important for me and for us to think about if you're interested in culture, because to a certain extent, one of the things, not the only thing that art does, but it's a language of prestige. It's a place where people create the common symbols that you talk to other people to let them know that you have a shared experience, a shared set of values and references. And if the symbols that people are absorbing change, that changes how people process arts and culture in the long term. And I was just thinking about, one of many attempts by myself to think about, the changing language of art, the changing expectations of the audience, the changing ways that symbols circulate. So I think it's particularly important. And then the last thing I'll say about it, so as not to speak too long, is that it's also an attempt of mine to think about a particular genre of art and tech work, or a particular feature of the art and tech conversation, where, one thing I particularly notice in a lot of particularly AI-based, but not just AI-based, this is also in the NFT conversation and stuff, is artists who work with technology or technologists looking at works of art from history, particularly dystopian works of art, that are specifically meant as a warning about some kind of potential future
Can you
scenario.
name an example here?
Yeah, like Blade Runner, or the metaverse. The term the metaverse comes from a work of science fiction, and almost like looking at that and just missing the moral, ethical, political component of the artistic critique, what the point of the thought experiment was in the first place, and just taking it as like sort of a direct inspiration for yeah, let's do this. It's a cool thought process. In my last article I wrote about the OpenAI's new thing, which takes inspiration from science fiction movie Her, their attempt to create like a Her-like virtual assistant. I was quoting a tweet that's sort of defines this for me, where it's like the first tweet says, science fiction author, I wrote my book, The Torment Nexus, to tell people as a cautionary tale. And then the next line is like, technologist, finally, we are able to give you the torment nexus from the classic novel, Don't Build the Torment Nexus. And I was seeing that a lot, that pattern a lot. And I think that represents to me a balance of forces, like the kind of ethical, political, historical ways of thinking about what culture does or should be doing that you learn on the humanities side is really at a disadvantage to the technical side. I have great respect for technology as a thing that can change the world, can be very creative. I sometimes don't see it that reciprocated.
Can you talk about the privilege of dystopia, Cécile? Because this is something that we got into in our previous discussion.
Yeah, I mean, it really, I don't know, it just really moves me to hear you talk about this, because it was a huge part of my research at one point, the privilege to be able to look at something like Blade Runner and just see it for its aesthetics, or also to uphold it as this kind of warning. And also in the media around that time, I would say around 2014, 2015, there was a thirst for the apocalypse. The New York Times was running articles like How to Survive the Apocalypse. The Guardian, the band Arcade Fire was we're putting out an album to dance our way through the apocalypse. And it makes me also think a lot about a writer that means a lot to me called Lauren Berlant. And they talked about something called cruel optimism. And when they talked about it, it was in reference to something like the American dream, this kind of aspiration. And I think, and how those aspirations actually trap us and make us unable to live through what we are actually experiencing. And I think this thirst for the apocalypse and a lot of the artworks that were born out of the privilege of not paying attention to the ethics being proposed in some of these references, there's a missed opportunity to do something that I call now, I just discovered this morning, compassionate pessimism, which is yes, these terrible things are happening.
Your term?
I just made it up.
That's great.
Yeah,
Great.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Lauren Berlant.
Venting things on stage right now.
Yes. Well, this idea of yeah, these things are happening, and we didn't listen to the signs that were given to us for the last hundred of years, coming to technology. I say hundreds of years because the first mention of AI taking all of our jobs and wanting to murder us was a play by a Czech playwright. It was called Rossum's Universal Robots, Karel Čapek. We've been talking about this for a while. And I think what we forget, and
yes, I guess robots themselves are an example of, of the torment nexus effect.
Exactly. And I think as an artist, I'm just like really interested in like, yeah, things fucking suck, but like we still have to exist within that. And like I still have to get up, and a lot of people have to get up, and people in Gaza have to get up and like live as much as we can. So I think it's about holding space for that pessimism, which is important, that critique, but also with a certain dose of being compassionate. And like hope in that framework are just ethical questions of how to live together, basically.
I think that's really interesting because we have gone through this shift where technology was supposed to enable a better life. You get through this utopianism in the modernist age, you know, right up and until about, I would say, 2008 even, or 2009, you know, the internet as the last kind of large technological iteration was supposed to change the way we talk, supposed to like level out and get rid of hierarchies and enable freedom of expression. And now we're in this stage where corporations really control what we do on the internet and really use our data as well to train their own new products, which then they then sell back to us. And so I'm wondering about this inflection, because if you look at earlier works by artists such as Rebecca Allen, they're really very much in this kind of utopian mode where they're using technology to really create advanced art forms. And I wanted to ask you, Cécile, where you stand on this inflection, because I mean, some of your recent works that really take colloquial forms of technology, such as the reality TV format, and turn them into artworks that forecast into the near future. So I think one of your works is set in 2030, and I wondered if you could talk us through your process there and your thoughts.
Yeah.
That was a long question.
That's okay. I want to take the first part, which I think is about, what is the first question in that?
It was about this inflection, right? When you get a lot of artists who, up to about 2010, were making very utopian artworks using technology, and how technology was actually driving artistic avant-garde.
No, it was about, you said something really important about modernism. So I made a film in, a whole body of work called Amos's World, which was centered around this figure of the egomaniacal brutalist architect, because this is a point in architecture where it was like, we are proposing you a whole way of life that is going to make your life better. Like Le Corbusier basically said when he built l'unité d'habitation in Marseille, like, you will never have to leave the building. And
machines for living, yeah.
Yes, and but this was based on a very restrictive set of data called the Architect's Book of Data, which is about like what a human body is and like how it behaves, what its scale is, what its size is. And there's an important allegory between, because when you say technology was meant to do all of these things, that's because companies promised us that. Like when I was a preteen and Apple came around and said like, this thing is going to make your life better, I was like, yeah, sign me up. This sounds great. And now I'm 41 and like, I can't open my laptop because the screws are patented and I can't replace the battery, so I have to make more money to buy another one in order to do my job. Like, I think that's where we're at. And I do think we missed a significant, I think there was opportunity and still is, because there has to be, otherwise, like, what is the point? Basically, like Tim Berners-Lee, who conceived of the World Wide Web, which is the platform that we use on the internet. Because like reality, there is no such thing as one internet. There are internets. It's just the World Wide Web has become the one that we use. But there was this crucial moment where I really believe as human beings, we could have evolved to develop skill sets to be able to sort information. Like a lot of the things we're dealing with today of like fake news, real news, all of this other stuff, that was outsourced to companies. And in return, we had someone like Steve Jobs who would present the iPhone, boom, like it was this like magic, like this piece of magic, basically telling us, don't worry, we got this for you. And so now we find ourselves in this world, like fully inhabited alongside these tools, and for most people not understanding what they're contributing to, what agency they can have within that. I mean, that said, compassionate pessimism, I think there are really exciting movements, some that Ben has talked about within that are starting to not just reclaim, because that's such like a buzzword, but like misuse tools to find ways to create structures of mutual aid and things like that.
So basically hacking the system in a sense.
Yeah, 100%. And then, sorry, Ben, go.
Ben looked like you wanted
Oh no, before we go, I genuinely want to know where this audience is on this inflection point. Like I genuinely want to know who we're talking to so we can orient the conversation. So I just wanted to ask, and I'm going to give you 3 options, whether you're generally optimistic about technology, generally pessimistic about technology, or agnostic. So just so you know in advance. So who would consider themselves generally optimistic about the direction of technology? Okay.
Wow.
about a third. Okay,
It's useful. It's more than I would have thought. And who here considers themselves generally pessimistic? Oh, I don't know. That's a little. That's.
Fewer.
And then agnostic. Okay.
So most people are generally optimistic.
Yeah.
Can
So
I add-
that
can I
changes the
add
conversation for me.
Can I
'cause
add another option?
Yeah.
Ambivalent, which is you feel optimistic and pessimistic all at once.
Oh yeah, so some is good, some is bad.
Chaos. Chaos. Is
Chaos.
right. I think that's great actually, because I think that when you said at the beginning that there's a particularly heightened conversation, like that's what I think that means, is that kind of emotional chaos around this, that it does feel like there's tremendous optimistic promises, but also like really disorienting downsides that are like really close and intimate to people.
I'm being asked on a daily basis by platforms that I use quite often in the course of my job as an editor here at Art Basel, do I give consent for images that I made privately to be used to train large adversarial networks? And I just sit there thinking, of course not, this is my private data. But then I've already consented its use to storage in the cloud because that benefits me. So I think that's where some of this ambivalence comes from. And I wanted to go into an old discussion from 2015 when we were looking at kind of post-internet art and looking at art's collision with network culture. Well, it's 9 years ago, It's quite weird, though, to think about that in that way.
Yeah.
Anyway, and there's a nice quote from Corey Archangel that we also discussed, like, leading into this conversation. And he said in a 2015 book, Mass Culture, as an artist, what is my role on the internet? And he meant that, he's not a programmer, he's adopting a great number of systems, and he's trying to make art in a space that's not natively meant for art. And I wanted to twist that and rephrase it. As an artist, what is my role within this new technological paradigm? And I was wondering, Cécile, if you could comment on that.
I mean, really, I work so much with technology because it's the time we exist in. Like, if I had lived when Gutenberg invented the printing press, like, maybe I would make, like, Gustav Messer, like, works about the printing press or something, eating itself. But I think it's, like, basically the same as, like, my role in the world, which is, like, I don't have any authority. I just, like, my function is to live in it and to exist it and to pay attention to it and how it impacts people. And like, I mean, the way I do research, like, I think a lot of people have this idea of like what was called post-internet artists, that, that we don't have studios or that they don't have studios, and like they just exist on their computers all the time. And like, yes, I spend a lot of time doing a lot of research because like there's the anarchist library that I love, and like Reddit is a crazy forum to get to talk to people about really specific topics that I want to know more about. But it's equally important to me to then go and like for example, I was researching antimatter, so I went to CERN and talked to physicists. And also talking to them, not so that I can become an expert on antimatter, but so that I understand how this functions right now for people who are experts, and also talk to people around me and constantly take these surveys. So that's how I engage with technology. And then on like a material level, like these are the tools at my disposal. And it's not that I feel myself, like I feel like I get a lot of invitations to do VR works, and there are great VR works, but I haven't had an idea that needs VR. So like, I don't, like inviting me to do that doesn't really make sense until I say I want to do a VR project because, this particular modality for an audience member, I feel like they really need this for this question or this subject. I think that's how I relate to it.
And Ben, what made you choose that quote in the first place? Because you cited it in this article that you wrote, or in one of the chapters of the book.
I cited my book. Because, look, I think that's what makes Corey Archangel one of the greats. I mean, because he's a comedian. And almost all of his works take the form of a joke about how technology makes something that was some sort of experimental or modernist thing incredibly easy. And that's the structure of almost all of his works. And I think that is a genuine problem that people don't talk about enough. I think in general, there are an extraordinary number of basic problems about the relationship of art and technology and the history of that relationship that just are unanswered, you know, or are latent but not talked about. Like, I'll give you an example I think about a lot, which is that Laszlo Moholy-Nagy is light space generators, where if you see them in the museum, you'll talk about how this thing is about how like light and space interact. Well, the truth is that those artworks were very influential. They were seen by like San Francisco artists who were inspired by them to do the first like serious concert rock and roll light shows in the 1960s. And that, what he was experimenting with, why that was shocking and impactful, diffused in the visual environment. And, you know, when I was at the concert last night, you know, you're getting a piece of that back, not through the art system, but through the general environment that has diffused it. But that like circuit is not really closed when you're in the museum. So it's like continuously presenting something as this very like brain conversation when it was actually a body conversation that then like diffused out and became like invisible. So the people's experience in the museum, my hypothesis, the audience's experience in the museum is like a kind of a little bit of a confusion, particularly people who haven't like absorbed that history through college. Same thing I feel about like appropriation art, you know, and Richard Prince will say this directly, you know, when he looks at his daughter playing around on Tumblr, like circulating images, he has a great quote where he's just like, I looked over, she goes, what are you doing? This is amazing. This is exactly what I was doing with my light box in the 80s. Where did you get the credits for this? And he says, his daughter looked at me like I was the man from Mars, and he was like, that's my girl. But that is a problem for the paradigm of appropriation in the museum because you're continuously presenting it in this way that's like, oh, it's all about this kind of like specific operation of using the museum to recontextualize the images and stuff. Well, that's also just the way people very naturally communicate. Now, if you go to the other side and you embrace that, so like you'll kind of corny gestures like museums will try and present like Warhol. He was like Instagram before Instagram. And that presents a question because it's like, is that what he was doing? Is that all what he was doing? And then in that case, how do we view it now? I think that the question of the status of the artwork, what the specific nature of the operation is, like remains undefined, is loose, and like kind of answering that question of what the specific operation that an artwork is doing that is special, that makes it stand out from the general visual environment or intellectual environment or conceptual environment right now is the artistic question. And the way we talk about it is very diffused, maybe deliberately, because maybe people don't have the questions, maybe people don't want to answer the questions because it opens up a whole can of worms.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, before I forget something, like, I think you're saying something really important also about value adding. That becomes like another layer that audiences have to pass through in the museum, where already they've had to usually pay an exorbitant ticket price, leave their home, get dressed, do all of this other stuff. But I also like thinking in the spirit of Corey Archangel's humor, there's not much transparency, and it is presented like it, you know, with the sort of value of like an already established piece of body of work, like a Warhol or, you know, an Yves Klein or something. I have a slide up here of a show that was co-commissioned by Tate Liverpool, Haus der Kunst, Mito Art Tower, like a lot of really big museums. And it was a 27-screen installation with 2 humanoid robots, a robot dog, a water fountain, and 3 screens. It was an automated play. And the thing just kept breaking down, like, because the robots were tired. Like, Tate Liverpool is open 7 days a week. And I became like a union rep coming in to like negotiate like breaks for the robots, like more reasonable like charging times, like maintenance, support teams, like psychotherapy for the staff. Like, You know, it's this thing where actually then
a whole new practice out of this.
That whole behind the scenes, which I now do have brought into my practice, like in the lead up to making these projects, because I think that transparency is like what people experience. Like the audience in Liverpool, some of the questions were like, why can't I get my printer to work? That is an incredibly valid question. Like that's an ancient piece of technology at this point. Like, how do we stop a robot insurrection? Like, you put a conforming door handle on the door. Like they won't be able to, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's like your
we're
vacuum
missing
cleaner
so
can't-
many important conversations through the fortress of these institutions that feel really scared about something that like actually we're all kind of just going through. Like you said something really lovely yesterday about like projections of the future and how we sort of miss this possibility that it could just be a little stupid, you know? Like it might not be the horrible dramatic thing all the time, you know, or like the utopian thing all the time. It might just kind of be a weird chaotic mix of both with like a lot of stupidity interspersed in between. Yeah.
I think that's quite an interesting point, and it certainly feels more akin to our lived everyday existence, where we're dealing with these glitches all the time. And if you look at sort of the mediocre quality of some of the works that come out of DALL-E and Midjourney and whatever, you know, because like everyone's like, oh, it's all about the prompt, but then you refine your prompt and still ChatGPT is producing an essay that's not even worthy of a first-year art historian. You're just like, come on, you know, and it just feels like we're at this stage where the technology is actually kind of crappy, like it's being oversold to us almost, you know.
Depends on how long you spend with it.
Yeah?
Because like, I've enjoyed my time on Midjourney because it's also about the community. Like prompting is a skill, you know, like people spend a lot of time figuring out how to make good, like it's all how you use it, you know.
Well, I mean, just to say, that is another argument against apocalypticism, you know, that is very common to hear right now, which is that, you know, that's actually a kind of marketing for tech companies, you know. It's like to say, like, we're going to destroy everything, you know, like we are that powerful, you know, you have either get on board with our technology or you will be left behind and destroyed. Like that is a form of marketing, I think, and in conscious and unconscious ways people use it. And there's this way that people would like us to think about the robot apocalypse and not the near-term thing, which is just, you know, lots more spam, you know, lots of junk, and the degradation. The thing is that with AI in particular, I have a hard time being optimistic about it because I see what it does. I think that you also need to separate out. I did want to make this distinction at the beginning. You really need to separate out artistic uses of AI, which of course artists, this being what they do, can look at a thing and find a way to use it in an extraordinary, weird.
And
a lot of time. You mentioned time.
We don't need it to be good is the difference. Making it good is hopefully our job.
Yeah, exactly. Of course, that can happen, and that is different than its impact on society or its latent
So as a tool
default use cases, and those things, those two conversations connect. You know, because one of the things I think big tech companies would like to do is use artists to advertise the more mundane use cases and to make them over with a kind of a creative sheen. But they are distinct conversations that are worth talking about. One of the reasons why I think I am so pessimistic about it is because I see what AI, those generative AI specifically, does as sort of actually not that new, actually, like more of a continuation of the degradation of the conditions of the production of writing that I have experienced over the course of the internet age. You know, this is what it does. It's designed to produce lots of content on trend at scale without a lot of thought going into it, and that's like a process of, you know, the entire internet world writing world has experienced, and it's, you know, you understand why your boss at this point looks at this stuff and is like, oh, you know, this is basically what you do, right? You know, you write things in a different.
Yeah. I'm just going to
question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. Can you maybe this is a question for you. Can you maybe define a little bit, like, what is the concern with generative AI? Is it a market thing? Is it a quality thing? What is it for you, or for what you as a researcher? have mostly picked up on?
I mean, I think my concern is actually a legal issue, really, and it's about copyright, and it's about use of artistic works and proper remuneration of artists. And it's also it's something to do with when something like Midjourney is open source, and I believe that the images generated by Midjourney are actually in public domain. However, something like DALL-E, the images remain property of OpenAI, right? And it doesn't matter that they took any artist's works to train this kind of GAN on them. The artists are not seeing compensation. This is where we're having the big legal cases that are currently ongoing. So my concern is not with whatever this tool is doing. My concern is the remuneration of the creatives who are behind this. And there I was like thinking about Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst's project, The Spawning, you know, where an artist can register and say, I don't want my works to be used within this data set, where they're also having a browser extension that looks whether or not they've been used, and we just don't have any regulation, you know, and there's going to be some form of regulation. There's the EU AI Act coming in, for example, that will affect this matter.
Yeah.
And so that is my concern. My concern is not so much about the ontological status of technological artworks. I think that debate, as we said, is like 100 years old or more than 100 years old. Yes, it is an avant-garde form of art making. Great. It's more about data usage.
Yeah.
Well, can I say what my biggest concern with it?
Please.
Okay, because I think that
I'm doing like field research right now.
because I mean, and there are many and varied. This is an unwieldy conversation, but I think the environmental impact of it of AI is the huge thing, and the huge thing makes me question the narrative that it's the future. I actually, without some sort of new paradigm, I do not believe it is the future. You know, because look, I know people who are. It's like all real estate dudes are doing in the U.S. is buying up farmland for data centers.
Yeah.
That's what's happening. They're using up water. We don't have that much time, livable time left, and we're wasting it. If we want to use this godlike technology, we need to use it in a judicious way. And the way the conversation is unfolding right now is so chaotic that this is not really that conversation is just. I actually kind of hope the same way that like cryptocurrency had a huge carbon cost, and then when it became an NFT, an artistic project, suddenly people were talking about that. Like I kind of hope that when the artistic conversation around AI would amplify that conversation in a different way, and then regarding the as a sub theme from the ecological thing. One thing that just drives me a little bit crazy about the conversation about any art and technology, where there's this kind of stock thing, which is just like, well, people don't like it now, but people say that about all new mediums, and eventually they get used to them. Like, oh, it's just like photography. People freaked out with photography. Well, that can be somewhat true, and also have differences. You know, there is a difference between like early photography, which is a lot of small entrepreneurs, and AI, which is a lot of big tech. I mean, it cannot exist without global scale corporations. And I think to me, it's a little bit like saying it's just like, well, people have always been worried about pollution, right? You know, like, you know, the London fog, that was really just like smoke from early industrialization. And that's true on one level. And they did deal with that. You know, there is no more London fog. But on the other hand, there's a lot more at stake with climate change. I mean, we know that technology does not always run in a way that's sustainable.
No, absolutely.
And I just wish the conversation did not swing between like, oh, it's great, it's going to change everything, to like, oh, well, I mean, you know, it's like
in a weird inflection.
We need to reject it all, and there's like some kind of nuance in the middle.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an interesting interjection where we're using AI to look at climate change, which seems like anyway. So I actually wanted to switch the conversation to reception, which is something that was.
But can I say something first?
Okay.
Thank you. So what's really interesting between your two answers that and the way that I do research is it makes me understand that the question is not really about the contents of the question. For me, then the question becomes, what have we not solved yet before, like artists being paid properly is already a huge problem. To some extent, I can't even care about the appropriation discussion because I'm still thinking about, how are my friends going to pay their rent next week? You know, like that's already not happening in a way that it needs to. And also not just in the art world. Like, why is there, like before we have, AI appropriating work, which also I think I answered the other day. Like I kind of, it's hard for me to care whether people know about my work as my work in 100 years. Like, I just want people to like have a house and be able to feel joy in 100 years. Like, I'm too worried about that to be thinking about, about these other things. And also this, the other problem is like, before we start generating all of these images and stuff like that, like, we need to think of like a pluralistic energy transition that also doesn't involve replacing everything with electric batteries and mining lithium, nickel, and copper mines. Like these are all problems. These are the questions to me that are like just underneath the surface of these like what feel like very urgent, shouty headline questions and I'm always also wondering, why are we more comfortable defaulting to talking about this thing really far ahead than first dealing with the things that we need to deal with now? Sorry, thank you.
Of course, thank you for that very thoughtful kind of response to both mine and Ben's answers. And now now it's moved on, but we can talk about reception, which started as a project that you did with the fashion brand Miu Miu.
Yeah.
And I noted here that reception is one of the last surviving human translators. A storage apocalypse has occurred, resulting in the wiping of all digital memory, and she is in the business of imprinting people's memories onto the machines, creating a linguistic seed bank. And I wanted you to talk about the research and the genesis behind this project, and why you want to talk, and why you had this like moment of memory obliteration. Like, what was the significance?
Yeah. So just for myself, because the Miu Miu invitation, I already had an idea for a feature-length film that is about one of the last human translators in a time where there is a storage crisis because there is a lithium, there is a mineral crisis, an energy crisis, and a huge portion of the population who couldn't afford the storage upgrade, their own memory gets wiped. And I think the idea for this project came from sort of where my work intersects a lot between feelings and technology. And is like, I was talking with my general practitioner about a repressed memory, like a traumatic event that a whole chunk of my life I don't remember. And with like a trauma counselor, I was doing my research work instead of my personal work, and learning that the way that memories in that moment work is like there's a conversation that happens between the body and the memory, and is like, okay, danger, danger, the body can't handle this memory. But instead of shoving it into a drawer in your mind, it breaks up into fragments and becomes a network throughout your entire body, which of course informs physically, psychically, like how you move through the world. And I thought that this was such an interesting way also to talk about how fragmented our digital storage, our memories have been. Like my phone is at its best like a prosthesis for my mind, because my mind can no longer hold that many images at once. What happens when that goes away, and what does that network look like, and how do we begin, instead of having like there's an amazing psychoanalyst who talks about traumaphobia, traumaphilia, like how do we begin to exist and live with like the insanity of all of our personal memories like that are scattered throughout these networks.
I mean, amnesia is also a form of self-protection inside of psychotherapy.
Of course. Yeah. And also when you delete a file, like, correct me if I'm wrong, but like it doesn't disappear.
No.
You just no longer have the language to access it anymore. And it does essentially break up into these fragments. And so this project that's sort of the real beginning point of that, but also to ask these questions, these ongoing questions about, the company that the translator works for. is a global organization that's trying to salvage memories on the network, but it's also the company that caused the crisis in the first place, and what these closed power loops that we find ourselves in right now are about. Yeah.
I think that's, I'm just like so compelled by this project, just because it's not, I don't think it's apocalyptic. There's a very real risk of a data center going down, of a virus attacking a data center. We have this all the time. I mean, one of the biggest risks to us right now is a malevolent virus attacking power stations and power networks and the internet, or satellites, which we rely on for communication. So I think it's interesting how you are putting this human angle into it and saying there is a human form of retrieval in there. And I also wanted to just go back to the phone, because one of your quotes that you gave in an interview is, on my phone that I carry with me all the time, that's what's carrying my memories. It's mine. It belongs. Because I do think we forget, and I'm not here to tell people what that relationship is. I think it's just a moment to learn for yourself that things don't exist without what's stored on them. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, I think I was also talking about it in like, why don't we treat our phones the way we do our watches or clothes? Like, when they're broken, we repair them. When they're old, we still value them. Like, I think there's just like a weird relationship. We just sort of agree that we have to, and of course that's because of companies. I think I was thinking a lot about obsolescence and like what the possibility for a kind of resistance to that could look like on an individual and like small community level, because the character reception is almost like the actress Gustave Gimelonda called her future Black Amish, of like how to constantly repair these things, but absent of a kind of nostalgia from a sort of practical thing. And also as these like collective structures of that coming from a grassroots movement and like exchange, like a different kind of debt. Like, I give you an idea, you give me an idea, that makes us part of a community. How that could begin to grow as an alternative to these companies just holding this power. Because a lot of times I'm looking at how, what happens when our feelings, when our lived experience, because what reception is doing is basically taking people's memories, things as they were, as people lived them, and transcribing them to history. And there's already a loss. You drag a file from one folder to another, you always lose like little bits and pieces of things. And I guess I'm trying to work out for even just myself, like, I lost it, sorry.
So I just wanted to tell you, this is an irrelevant aside. This is an aside, but I was reading that quote about the future Amish. What is it? Future
Black Amish.
And I just wanted to tell you, before I was an art writer, back in the early days of the internet, there was this website that published serial fiction. And the first thing I wrote online was a serialized science fiction novel. That was essentially, the premise was, what would the Amish be like in the far, far future when medical science has solved everything, so that people don't really understand mortality anymore, and like go as tourists to see what it's like to have actual the kind of non-technological relationship people. In any case, that's an irrelevant aside. It's a crazy coincidence between our two bodies of work.
I can't wait to read your book in full. But it was about feelings, and when they come into contact with these structures, and like our feelings start to rebel, because it's like the thing we really can't control, as much as we try to pay psychoanalysts to do. But like, there's something like we can gain power from listening and looking at that rebellion and what happens in those moments. That was it. Yeah.
I think this idea of control is very interesting, control of one's artistic output. And I wanted to shift gears again a little bit to something that Ben wrote. I mean, Ben, Instagram has been around for 12 years now, and it's really had quite a significant impact on the way we share art, on the way we purchase art, and on the way we talk about our artistic practices. And it would be, I think, quite foolish to deny that. And Ben, you've talked about Bourdieu in this context, that Instagram is a form of a symbolic revolution, a shift that produces the very structures through which we perceive it, establishing new structures which become invisible the more they become generally recognized, widely known, and incorporated by all the perceiving subjects in the social universe. So basically, I think I quoted that correctly. And so basically, by using Instagram yourself as an end user, as an artist, as a gallerist, as a museum person, because all museums use this channel, you are changing the way we see art. And I think one of the most interesting things, and we were discussing this, is that the recent re-rise of figurative painting is in part attributable, pardon me, to Instagram. I mean, you were talking about the Bianca Bosta
I think
book.
it's pretty clear it is, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think it's even a hypothesis.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that's kind of interesting. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your thought processes there.
Okay, well, I also feel like I'm dying to know what the audience wants to know about. But since we haven't really directly talked about the title, which is, like erasing or, what is it? Technology, erasing or amplifying?
Expanding or erasing.
Okay, well, the Instagram conversation is a great way into that for me, because I guess what I would say is that the idea of an art world depends on the idea of an inside and a cultural inside and outside. There's a place or a way of thinking that people have that reframes things as its own kind of like social world. It has its own kind of values. I think this context, frankly, that we live in is holding on to it, even to a certain extent, advertising that idea of an art world as a closed cultural space. However, my sense is that it's like we're in one of these moments where like people's like there's a word de-aption, I think, which is like where people are holding on to ideas that no longer fit the circumstances. Because I think people have this idea of the art world as this closed inside, when actually like it's a porous networked outside, which is to a great extent is due to Instagram. There's a book for our podcast. Please like and subscribe to our podcast at Artnet, the Art Angle. My editor told me to say that. This book called Get the Picture, which is about the New York art world, and it purports to be a reporter embedding with various institutions of the New York art world and talking about, what she takes away from it is this old idea of the art world. It's like, isn't the art world weird? Like, they talk like aliens. They have their own special insider language, which people have been saying, like, that's the Tom Wolfe's thesis about the art world from 1974 in The Painted Word. Actually, though, when I read her book, what I read is when she goes to dealers, when she talks to an artist studio, when she talks to collectors, what the common denominator is they're all on Instagram all the time, constantly.
Yeah.
And only a single art critic is mentioned in the book by name, and it's Jerry Saltz, and it's about a tweet he wrote. Like, I think people's values, how they're valuing art, how art circulates has changed, and people haven't, realized that. I think, and some people in the book, I don't think she makes as much of it as she should, but, she literally has collectors in the book being like, I can't read that art criticism, I tried to read art since 1900. It doesn't make sense to me. I follow gallery directors I like, and then I follow the artists that they follow. And that's what makes value and meaning for me. And I think that conversation, for a lot of people, has replaced the valuation systems that were formed around certain kind of intellectual specialist language that has a certain kind of value. That I still, I have reservations about the art speak world. But I mean, I think that we are living in a new world. And that's one of the things that you might mean by erasing, is that the rules of the game have changed without people's minds catching up to it, and they have changed because of the technology, and they've changed according to its rules. That's part of what it means that we haven't cognized it, is that we're playing by their rules without knowing it.
I mean, I think the erasing part also comes from this idea that the art world is this closed fortress that needs to be dragged down somehow, and that we're too elitist, and that we don't include certain types of discussion, and therefore by offering up these new platforms, that's when everyone can participate. And yet we have this paradox where people want to enter the more, shall we say, established art world because this is where you have recognition, this is where you do, I mean, you talk about people following artists.
You have cachet.
Yeah.
Like one of the effects of online stuff is it disaggregates everything. It puts everything into competition with itself. Your artwork is in the feed with, every other.
Yeah, the economy of attention becomes incredibly dispersed.
Levels everything. It produces a great sense of leveling, which produces a great sense of cultural dislocation for people, which in turn means that, there's a huge hunger for status. Anything that feels like they give me
Clout.
something, like some community to hold on to that's a little bit more specific than everybody. Among other things, there's a lot of things going on in the NFT conversation, but one of the things was that. I mean, one of the things was literally just like, yeah, maybe this is silly, but it's like, it's an attempt to square the circle of how you have like universal attention space, but have something that feels like it's yours, and feels like a little bit subcultural. And you can look at the NFT moment, that moment, as being a moment when you see what a kind of art world looks like that I think we are moving towards. That's post institutions of criticism and post physical institutions, and what you're left with is influencers and various kind of people pumping their own bag. Yeah.
I mean, I think that was a question around disintermediation, right? And I think 2-3 years ago, that would have been a very different discussion to the conversation we're having now, just because of what happened after the NFT collapse. But it certainly was an attempt to create a parallel market that was not mediated by the traditional gatekeepers of the art world as we see it now. And I think that discussion...
Which is good. That there's good to that.
Yeah.
I mean, there are people in this audience probably doing interesting stuff. I mean, I'm a little like, the art world, and just next to myself, it's like there was so much hype and scam in that moment. But to a certain extent, what the NFT people say, which is like, how is this different than the Maurizio Catalan's banana? Like what you do here at Art Basel. Like they are right about that. There's a certain sense in which like discourse generates value.
No, yeah, definitely. I mean, that's Bourdieu's entire... Yeah. I just wanted to, because we're almost at the end, and I just wanted to end. Finally, how do you feel about the future as an artist, as a critic, reflecting forwards 10 years? Pessimistic, ambivalent, optimistic for art? Big question, huh?
Compassionately pessimistic still, an hour later.
Still.
Not much has changed. No, I mean, I guess I can only... okay, so there's two parts. There's like the part of me like that is the creative me that uses the future as a container that makes people more comfortable to talk about stuff that's happening now. I mean, there's the famous quote by William Gibson, I do science fiction to talk about the real things that are happening now. Octavia Butler, who's also a huge inspiration to me, did this, but past and future and present all sort of collapsing and interspersing with one another in her book, The Kindred, which is phenomenal. So I think I'll just continue to do that. I'm definitely not predicting anything. I mean, anything that people think I've predicted, it was really just because I was listening and it was already being said. And then in terms of as an artist and the art world, I think there's something, I think I really am on board with what you're saying. There's a danger in the royal we that's emerging in the job that I do, interfacing with, not the market, because I have galleries, thank you, but institutions and private foundations and stuff, where we just all have to be very conscious that royal we is increasingly shutting out anyone who's living in society, and there has to be space for that, because that, as artists, we, at our best, sometimes are living in society or are living out of society, but we're unreasonable. We are not reasonable people. That's, we're not politicians or doctors, so nothing we do is going to be perfect in that way. And then also to what you were explaining about this in and out and the fear of relevancy as, institutions become more elite, so to speak, to the public, which is a very fair, critique, is also there's been a whole 10 years of trying really hard to make things more accessible, but the terms and conditions haven't changed. So when you invite accessibility in, the structure has to change for that to actually happen, because we are still talking about people. Even with technology, there's a whole labor force behind that, So yeah, those are the things I'm concerned as a creative mind and as a admin mind.
Thank you. Ben, can you keep it short, please?
I'll keep it short. Yeah, I mean, the answer is chaotic. I feel like the audience, split in the audience sort of reflects my own mind. There's a great crisis of institutions. I mean, I would be surprised if there are art magazines left in five years.
Art magazines.
I mean, yes. I mean, but on the other hand, I think there is, shoots of, that reality is forcing people to have hard conversations about what comes next and what is really meaningful. And those are optimistic things to me.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from the audience? We do have roving microphones. Gentleman in the second row.
Very into living.
Thank you.
chaos.
I have a question, more like your opinion, because artists are quite advanced on the digital side, but your average institution is lacking decades behind. What is your opinion on how to bridge that gap, maybe?
Hire technicians, put them on staff, give them salaries. Oftentimes, for a project like the automated play, you'll bring in like a freelance technician at a museum. And I think this is, about having a salaried specialist. I mean, you see this, like Tate in London has a time-based media person in the collections who is like so on top of things. Like, that's my personal.
It is an interesting paradox in that you have kind of the most over-resourced aspect of society, which is the technology sector. And then in the art world, it's really like Natural Place to Live is the most under-resourced part of the art world, which is like nonprofits. They're nonprofit. They're not going to be on the cutting edge of most things because it's like a very slow institutional structure with very limited resources. So I don't know. I think people. I think artists should band together. I really think various forms of collective production are what the future moves towards. Possibly people producing some. One of the things I really notice in the contemporary media economy is, I would say, a convergence of media. Like, all things are converging on the same thing, particularly with generative AI, that like writers are performers, but also create something that competes in the space with art projects online. Like, I think there really is a general convergence of media and like what it means to be a creative individual. And I think in that context, it's all the more important to have like collective production where you could advocate for each other, create critical discourse for each other, create something that might look like a kind of an institution.
But I think we do have new forms of institution as well. I mean, one of the oldest ones is ZKM in Karlsruhe, then Heck here in Basel, has also, House of Electronic Arts has also been really focused on kind of newer forms of presenting art. I wanted to move to the gentleman in the third row.
I just wanted to ask, do you think that the economic incentives will simply overpower any conversation that happens at the level of the artist in terms of technology and the direction that things are going in?
Which economic incentive?
Yes, that's my, which one?
The incentives of the companies that are centralizing the communication networks.
You've worked. I mean, well,
I've never worked with
Miu Miu, so you.
I've never worked with a technology company. I've refused several offers for that reason, because I think I wouldn't be able to work in that structure in the way that there are governments I know I can't have fund my work because it would significantly limit what I can say. I've done research with like the Institute for the Future of Humanity, which has now been closed because Nick Bostrom was canceled, which was partly funded by Elon Musk. But I always maintain and am very transparent of having a critical distance. Working with Miu Miu, I appreciated that context because I knew it was a fashion show. It's not an exhibition. I was given carte blanche, but also the terms and conditions were dictated in such a clear way that I knew exactly where I stood and where I could dream and where I needed to take my dreams elsewhere. And I don't think that that's something that's possible from at least the invitations I have received from technology companies.
Well, I guess what I would say is, in general, likely, right? I mean, I think it's important to hold out. Otherwise, I think artists, they hold out the critical possibility of people. What I would say is one of the strengths of the art world, this art world that we are sitting in, is that it has a lot of institutions, that are in competition and in dialogue. One of the weaknesses of tech, in placement within tech for artists, is there actually aren't that many institutions. They're like quasi-monopolistic companies. That I would say is the main, as in addition to the obvious things about Google's not going to fund art that's critical of AI, which is part of what shaped something like Rafik Anadol's practice. However, it's like in a more competitive environment, then like people are basically bidding against each other for a cachet, right? It's like, and there's cachet and criticality and authenticity. So I think something we should preserve and look to that's good in the art world is its plethora of smaller institutions. Unfortunately, those are, I think there's a sort of a slow moving crisis there as well.
I feel there's something really important to say also, the collaboration with a company at its best in this transparency. I felt it was incredibly freeing and inspiring because there were regulated aspects of it. Like there were work hours, there was a contract, like it was very clear what my job was and wasn't, and that somehow those, and I also knew that the people, because I work with huge teams, like I bring in some of the best minds and hands, like I think of our generation in terms of technicians, musicians, and I knew they were all taken care of, and at this moment, that's not always the case in museums because they don't have capacity in the way that like a commercial company does. And like, again, I think it's very interesting, every technology company that has approached me, and I'm not saying that's the case for everyone, it's just personally, there hasn't been enough of that rigor and transparency and understanding and respecting like certain regulation things that actually make being able to be an artist like pretty great. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I think that's all we have time for, and it's a great note to end it on. Thank you both for that extraordinary, inspiring discussion. And thank you for listening.
Thank you everyone for listening.